Okay, welcome. Dr. Linda here. And today we're going to be talking about muscles. And when we talk about muscles, we're primarily going to be focusing on skeletal muscle and some of its properties and how does a muscle contract and what are the main components of the functional unit of skeletal muscle. And we'll talk about the neuromuscular junction and how a muscle contraction begins and how it ends. So a lot of neat stuff. But before we get into that, let's just review the three types of muscle. And this really is review because we've done this already when we talked about the four types of tissues. And we talked about connective tissue and epithelial tissue, muscle tissue, and nervous tissue. So when we talked about muscle tissue, we did cover skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. Of the three, we know that only one of them is voluntary, and the one that is voluntary is skeletal muscle. It is considered to be striated, but is the only one voluntary. Now, the other one that is striated is cardiac muscle, but it's involuntary. We know we cannot actively contract the heart on impulse, right? We can't say, okay, heart rate go from, 72 beats per minute to 120 beats per minute. We can't do that. The other unique feature about cardiac muscle, remember, it was highly branched and it had those intercalated discs. And within the intercalated discs are gap junctions, which are designed for fast, rapid forms of communication. Smooth muscle was also involuntary, and it's considered visceral muscle because we find it around the viscera or organs, like the gastrointestinal tract, like the respiratory airways, okay? And the smooth muscle around them involuntarily contract. You don't have conscious control over it. When we talk about skeletal muscle, primarily we think about skeletal muscles contracting, attaching to bones, and when muscles transmit their contractile impulse, they pull on tendons which are not very elastic, and since they lack the elasticity, they pull on the bone. The muscles themselves are elastic. They can extend and they do have elasticity, but tendons are pretty stiff. So when they contract, when the muscles contract and transmit the impulse to the tendon, to the periosteum of the bone, it can produce movement. Muscles can also stabilize body positions. We have very important core muscles, and those core muscles, like abdominal muscles and the erector spinae muscles and your calf muscles, they're designed to help stabilize the human body. They are also involved in storing and mobilizing substances within the body. And we'll see that muscles can store sugar in the form of glucose. That glucose that is stored in muscle is now referred to as glycogen. And anything that ends in ogen, O-G-E-N, is considered to be inactive. So glycogen is inactive sugar. It can become activated, and we'll show you how when we talk about something referred to as the Cori cycle, C-O-R-I, the Cori cycle. Okay, and also muscles can generate heat. We know that when muscles contract, if you're exercising, you get hot, you start to perspire. We know if someone has a fever and the fever needs to spike even more, they can get a febrile seizure, which is strong, rapid contractions of muscles to increase body temperature by generating heat. The properties of skeletal muscle, they are electrically excitable. We will be talking about the neuromuscular junction, which is really the union or junction of a neuron or an axon to the end plate of a muscle. So we're hearing these terminology that you may not have heard of before, right? Axon, neuron, end plate of the muscle. So it'll be better when I end up showing you a picture of what that looks like. Muscles can contract. I'll show you on the next slide what we mean by contraction. They do have the ability to extend, so they have extensibility and a degree of elasticity. When we talk about contraction, it's important to understand the difference between isotonic and isometric contraction, which you'll see here, isotonic versus isometric. When you look at concentric versus eccentric, if this person is standing and the book is in this position here, the starting position down, and their biceps brachii contract, which is an elbow flexor, it allows the elbow to flex and the arm moves up. That is a concentric contraction. That is when the origin of the muscle, which is up here, and the insertion of the muscle, which is down here on the radius, they approximate or they move closer together. That is concentric. They also refer to this as the acceleration phase. But if you slowly lower the book, like from here to here, that's an eccentric contraction. And I don't mean the book is too heavy and it falls. I mean, you're in control of that slow eccentric elongation. Good way to remember it. The E in eccentric for elongation of the muscle, okay, back to its resting state. This is known as the deceleration phase or the negative. So when you go to the gym, some people train and say, oh, I'm doing negatives today, which means slow movements elongating the muscle. And then here, if you're just holding the book straight out and these muscles are in contraction, and the term contraction literally just means that there is tension that is being generated in the muscle. Tension. You can have tension when a muscle is shortening, concentric. You can have tension when a muscle is elongating, eccentric. And you can have tension when there's no change in the joint angle here, then it's isometric. So we have concentric, eccentric, and isometric. Concentric is when the muscle tension exceeds the resistance. In the case of the picture, the resistance was the weight of the book, and the muscle shortened. That's where the origin and insertion moved closer together, and I said that's the positive contraction or acceleration, whereas eccentric was the negative or the deceleration. The eccentric contraction is when peak tension is less than the tension, the resistance, or the load, and the muscle elongates, which is where the origin and insertion move further apart from one another. And isometric is when the tension cannot exceed the resistance, which means there's no change in the joint angle at all whatsoever. So I'd like to go over a few terms that are kind of important to understand. And these terms are origin, insertion, agonist, antagonist, synergist, and the term innervation. When you cover muscles and you're studying muscles, and it doesn't matter if it's the trapezius, the latissimus dorsi, the biceps brachii, brachioradialis, extensor carpi radialis, longus or brevis, brachioradialis, brachialis, triceps brachii, coracobrachialis, sternocleidomastoid, right? The names go on and on and on. All of those muscles attach to bones by way of an origin and insertion, okay? The origin is usually the more proximal part, and it's usually the part that's staying still or stationary, whereas the insertion is usually the more distal attachment to the bone, and it's the part that's usually moving. So in this case here, when we were talking about the biceps brachii, the biceps originate up here, the short head on the coracoid process of the scapula, the long head on the supraglenoid tubercle of the scapula, and it inserts here on the radial tuberosity. So we have origin, insertion. When the origin and insertion move closer, that's concentric. When the origin and insertion move further away, that was eccentric. Okay? So that's origin and insertion. These are where the muscles attach to the bone by way of tendons. Now, some muscles are named because there's 2 tendons, like bicep. Maybe it's 3 tendons, like tricep. So keep that in mind. Some muscles are named by the number of tendons. Okay, agonist, antagonist, right? So these two sound like opposites, and they are. An agonist is the primary mover, or the main muscle that's providing the motion. An antagonist is going to oppose it. So if we talked about biceps brachii, which is an elbow flexor, the triceps brachii, which is on the opposite side of the bone, which opposes it, are antagonists. And again, keep that in mind. Agonists and antagonists are usually on opposite sides of one another. So biceps is anterior, triceps is posterior. Quadriceps of the thigh are anterior, hamstrings are posterior. Okay? Synergist is simply a muscle that assists. So if I were to say, what muscle is synergistic to the biceps brachii, if the biceps is an agonist of elbow flexion, we would just have to be familiar with another muscle that flexes the elbow, which is synergistic to it. And that could be the brachialis or the brachioradialis. Okay. Innervation. When you look at the word innervation, what do you see here? You see nerve, innervation. The muscles of the upper extremity, right, everything from the shoulder down to the fingers, are innervated by nerves that come off of the neck from levels C5 to T1. That group of nerves are referred to as the brachial plexus. Muscles of the lower extremity, right from the glutes or the hip muscles all the way down to the toes, they're going to come from two groups of nerve plexi that come from the lower back. One is the lumbar plexus and the other is the sacral plexus. So if you have nerve damage in your neck, I've had many patients that have had severe disc herniations or bone spurs or osteophytes or arthritis in their neck, putting pressure, especially at C5 and C6 in the neck, and then they have weakness in their arm muscles. And I've had people who have had sciatica, which is damage to the sciatic nerve in the lower back, primarily around L5 and S1. All of a sudden, they can't walk very well because their calf muscles are weak. So nerves give life and function to muscles. The more a muscle is stimulated by a nerve through movement, that muscle can thicken and hypertrophy. But if you have damage to a nerve, let's say you cut a nerve going to a muscle, it weakens and atrophies. So now you have atrophy and hypertrophy that are opposites. Okay, this is a good place to take a break, and when we come back, I will talk a little bit more about the microscopic parts of muscle.